I think it would be an appropriate time to welcome our guest this evening, Paula Gilhooly, who is the FASD, the lead education advisor for Adoption UK Scotland. Paula has a wealth of experience working in schools as a secondary school, primary school teacher. She still currently works in a school environment, but now primarily supports education in the Adoption UK circle. So basically supporting children with all sorts of different needs, families with all sorts of different needs, has a wealth of experience that we all call on, including myself, because, you know, we have very many different pathways within Adoption UK, but none of us know everything. But Paula very definitely knows a huge amount about education, and also a huge amount about the challenges that not only adoptive parents face, but families, parenting, individuals with FASD or a PAE history. So I would just like to say before we go that please feel free to type in the chat throughout this webinar any questions you may have. Paula and I have 2 or 3 breaks within this presentation where I can actually take your questions and speak to her and ask them live. Also to be aware that Paula is more than happy for you to email her post this webinar if you feel that you would welcome more advice on a particular problem, topic, or issue that you have personally. So whilst we can't address absolutely everybody's issues in an hour, we definitely can follow up. So definitely use the chat. The chat will be monitored. Obviously, Paula's not going to be able to answer the chat, but I will try and do what I can. But I'll definitely look at the questions and ask them at the appropriate breaks that we have. So without further ado, thank you very much. Welcome, Paula Gilhooly. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jo. I am going to share my screen. Let's see if I can actually make it work for me. Here we go. Slow thing. So just the only thing I was going to add to kind of what you'd said about me was that I started my education journey the wrong way round, because I went into secondary first and then gradually worked my way back down into primary. So the last kind of class of children that I taught would have been 5-year-olds. I was 5 when she came to live with me. So suddenly I got to see this whole new aspect of education through what it was like to be a parent when your child came home. And I got to see all of that part of it. And she has taught me from 5 years to the 15 years that she is now, has taught me an awful lot about teaching and the way that we need to teach and how different people's minds work. And that's changed my education practice. And I'm very grateful for what she has taught me. And she takes huge pride in the fact that I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now if it wasn't for her. And I'm also an adoptive parent as well. I can't remember if you'd said that. And Jo, when you asked me to come here today and speak, it made sense to me to talk about the things that crop up the most in the meetings that I have with families. And I need to say, I'm not, like you said, I'm not an FASD specialist. My kind of expertise, if you like, is more to do with education or to do with learning, and probably particularly now the different types of minds that we have coming through schools now. And I much prefer to focus on learning, because I think that that's what we're doing right now. It's not, it doesn't kind of have a finished point on it. So when our children are in schools, we're preparing them for what they're learning right there and then, but we're also preparing them to keep learning. It's not kind of finished, whereas education's got more of a kind of finished, almost like box around it, I think. And I know that when I leave today, whatever comes up in the chat is going to add to the learning that I'm doing. And hopefully wherever you live, because I know there are obviously people on the webinar tonight that are not residing in Scotland, but hopefully whatever I say about barriers will connect to something in your experience. But because I'm based in Scotland, I'm going to talk about how our Getting It Right for Every Child framework, which is our main vehicle for delivering support in school, I'm going to talk about how that works and how we can use that as parents. And some of that knowledge might be transferable to other systems. And then I wanted to focus on where we can direct our energy as parents to get the most out of school for our children, so that we don't reach the point of school burnout, because it's obviously something that a lot of children with additional support needs can reach that point of having no more energy left for school, but it can also happen to us as well. And then just that wee note of caution that, of course, I am still learning. So if something I say isn't quite right, or if I miss something, or if I've got the terminology wrong, just put it in the chat so that I can learn for next time. People who've done some of the Adoption UK courses might have seen this triangle before. There are kind of three perspectives that feed into each other to create the child's experience of school. And to get the best out of school opportunities for our children, there needs to be some sort of healthy balance in that triangle. And if we float too far to any one of those sides, then that experience for the child becomes skewed. And I think we probably disadvantage our child in the long run. And in an ideal scenario, what you would see is or the child would see, the adults working as a team to support them. And that might mean that the parent is getting to know the teachers, they're getting to know and understand how life in school works. And they might also have to acknowledge that actually in a class of 30, it's quite difficult, I suppose, to teach your child. And that, I would say that to probably everybody, that sometimes it's difficult to teach their child in a class of 30. But we also have to think about it from the teacher's perspective too. So teachers need to be open to learning about you. They need to be open to learning about your child, your family. They really need to be open to learning about FASD, and then changing practice based on what it is that they learn. If we're looking at the ideal scenario and we're looking at how everybody works together. And also what we want is the adults around the child to help the child to understand their life experiences. We need them to help the child understand their neurology, how that impacts their body, their brain, their behaviour, and help them to utilise their strengths and develop strategies to support the things that they find difficult. Because children do need help to make sense of themselves and make sense of the world. And my learning actually at the moment is, I'm not sure triangle encapsulates everything, because I'm beginning to wonder if it should be a square, and there should also be a little circle there that has something to do with peers that feeds into that experience for children. So that's maybe what, if you come back next time, that's maybe what I'll have a square. But what does get in the way? So potential barriers maybe facing children. So we've obviously got the barrier of prenatal alcohol and the impact that that's got, because that's going to affect the developing child. And we know that although there's common challenges to do with FASD, we also know that every child is different, and that probably we would apply to whether your child is autistic or your child has got ADHD. We need to look at the particular child that we've got in front of us and how the way that their brain is working, their early life experiences, how that feeds into the way that they're managing. So they don't all have the same school experiences, and some children are going to find school much easier than others. But I think from my experience, probably what I would say is that the demands of school, so the sensory environment, the learning, the remembering, the socialising, the emotional responses, and that restrictive movement that you have in schools, they're all hugely taxing for children. And for our children who have experience of care, we could also add in early life experiences and attachment patterns as a further difficulty in schools. So classrooms with one adult are very challenging places for children who need constant connection to feel safe, or perhaps I've got a teacher who's not understood the behaviour yet. Your child might be on a waiting list or have not achieved a diagnosis of FASD. And meanwhile, that child in the class is still doing their very best to make sense of themselves and their world. They're kind of trying to make sense of other people's reactions to their behaviours, the way that they've processed things. And we've also got that kind of public understanding of FASD. We know that, 1 in 20 people could have FASD, but we're not seeing those numbers diagnosed in schools. So in my school of about 650, we might have one, perhaps, diagnosed with FASD. So those numbers and that diagnosis has not made its way into, I suppose, the more general public, which I'm going to class as school staff. And when I talk to people about FASD, probably one of the things that might come back to me is something to do with facial features, which we know is a tiny minority of people, really. So FASD is very much a hidden disability within the context of school. So that's another barrier for our kids. And then finally, the environment and the social expectations can be quite restrictive for a lot of children within the school environment. So many children have got developmental needs that are out of sync with their peers. So we've got that spiky profile, we've got dysmaturity, we've got development that's slightly delayed, and those kind of things are not particularly well accommodated yet in our school system that groups everybody by age. And then when we think about parents, we've got, like, traditional parenting approaches tend not to work with children who've got neurodevelopmental conditions. So children need an approach that's going to take into consideration how their mind works and what their body needs. And if we continue to apply traditional approaches, and traditional approaches probably involve a punitive measure or a shame-inducing consequence, if we use that with our neurodivergent young people, then we're likely to escalate matters. So that adult's traditional approach becomes a barrier for the child. We also need to be mindful, I think, of our own history with school. If we didn't enjoy school, then we might be more likely to see school issues through a negative lens, or we might have more defensive conversations with teachers. And likewise, if we breezed through school, then we might consider our child to be failing by the standards that we are holding ourselves to, that we're holding our children up against those as well. And neither of those views is particularly helpful for our kids, because what we really need to do is to be able to stand back and look at where our child is in their development and where they are in their processing, and kind of take it from there. Learning's got to flow at the child's pace. And if we dive in at too high a level, so for example, if our focus is on spelling and spelling grades and raising spelling attainment so that it's more in line with peers, but we do that without taking into consideration the fact that maybe our child's missed enjoying sounds, learning rhythms, they've missed something to do with music or stories, then we might be pitching our energies at the wrong kind of thing, because we need to be looking at development gaps as well to make sure that when we pitch our learning, it's at the right kind of place. Children learn at their own pace, not at the pace that maybe the curriculum or their age is suggesting that they should be. And parenting is exhausting. So for those of us who are single parents, or we're working full time, or we're raising a child with complex needs, then the exhaustion ramps up. So we find ourselves running out of energy. And if your child is not able to keep themselves safe and you've got eyes on them all the time, then we can end up in this kind of state of kind of chronic stress, if you like. And when we're under stress like that, our responses aren't measured, they aren't calm, and we become dysregulated and maybe prone to sort of rash decisions. Our balance is compromised, basically. We end up making rash decisions that can escalate matters. And that is probably that midnight email to school. And I've certainly done that. When we're emotional and dysregulated, we don't get the response that we're looking for at all. And that's just as true for when you have conversations with teachers as it is for when you have conversations with your child. So that can become another barrier. And then the other thing that can get in the way of, sorry, Joe, were you speaking to me there?
No.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Another thing that can get in the way of supporting our children's learning is stigma. And whether that is other people's misfortune about FASD or care experience, which leads to unhelpful attitudes or behaviours, or whether it's our kind of our own fears about being viewed as not coping or at fault in some way. And we'll look at what to do about that in a wee while. And then the last one, and I think this is really important if you're not a teacher, is to consider the barriers that are facing teachers too. And the main one really is time, because we've only got so many minutes in a day to teach all the children in the class, and many of them are going to need additional support. And the practical aspects of managing that require time. There's also lots of paperwork, planning, evaluations, meetings, and practical organisation that has to take place outside of the time that that teacher is with your children. And then the other potential barrier is the very systems and processes that are supposed to help us. They help us to be fair, they help us to be transparent. So we need to use systems, but that can mean that, you know, communication, decision making, that's not always as quick as teachers want it to be. So for the parent that's waiting at home on a decision or a reply and is very frustrated in the home context, the same could be said for the teacher. And although, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, teachers enter the profession with a baseline knowledge, the majority of knowledge is built up and skill is built up over a period of time actually teaching. And it kind of brought me up short when I did a wee bit of research recently and was reminded that actually a postgraduate diploma in education can take 36 weeks to complete. So that's 18 weeks spent in college and 18 weeks spent in schools. So there's not an awful lot of time in that kind of early learning to be a teacher stage to devote to things like FASD or care experience or trauma. You kind of have to learn some of those things on the job. So one of the real barriers that's facing us is that knowledge, the lack of knowledge or skill. And it's entirely possible that a teacher's knowledge of FASD is going to be very small because those numbers we're not seeing in school yet. And it might be that their experience of teaching a child with an FASD diagnosis isn't there yet, because again, the numbers are really small. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind when you're like, do I have to explain FASD to this teacher or this new teacher again? But ideally what we want is a teacher to be open to learning and to drink in all the information that you're able to share and then transfer that knowledge and strategies into their everyday practice. And then class dynamics is another thing that kind of will affect or can potentially be a barrier for teachers. So if you've got an unfortunate mix in a class where you've got children that just happen to rub each other up the wrong way, or if you've got opposing needs in your class, or there are a lot of children with multiple complex needs, and there's only one of you, then trying to meet all of those needs at the same time is very difficult. But teachers have to do their best to overcome that so that everybody is learning, which brings us back to the same issue that's facing parents, which is that issue about chronic stress levels. And when a teacher is operating under extreme stress, then they are much less likely to be able to take on the new learning that we might be asking them to do, or to be able to frame things in a really positive way. So I am a really cautious person by nature, and I always look at the negative to start with. So that's all the negative. And I'm only kind of doing that because then I like to look for solutions and what we can do about it. So I think, Jo, this might be my pause at this point for anybody to come back with thoughts or comments or questions.
Yeah, I definitely think so. We've got a few comments coming up in the chat. I think a lot of them obviously are FASD related. I mean, people are asking things like, is there anything you can do to help with aggression and swearing for a 9-year-old? So I'm assuming that that question comes from issues in school. And like as a lived experience person with an individual that I'm parenting who's 13 with FASD, I think it's very, very difficult. I don't know if you'd agree, Paula, but I think it's very dependent on the teacher that you have being open to discuss, because as you say, teachers are clearly probably not trained with FASD and probably don't know much about it. So I think for parents, I think it would be really useful to know. Probably, I think the way that a parent can go in who has knowledge about FASD in their child to speak to a professional who is qualified to teach, that is always, I think, a really difficult situation, because a professional is a professional and a parent is a parent. And you may be a parent with huge lived experience, but you're not a doctor. You don't have Dr. so-and-so, but you may know more than the teacher. So I think it would probably be really beneficial to enable people to know how to frame their sort of conversation with a teacher without appearing to dismiss the teacher's ability, because I think that's what we hear so much.
Yeah, and that's the last section, unfortunately, Jo, where we talk about that. Talk about the telling the story in a way that doesn't alienate people. And a lot of that, I suppose, is to do with setting the scene. It's to do with putting it in the context of every child rather than my child. It's the things that that every child is entitled to. But the other thing I would say is it quite possibly comes down to communication or aggression and swearing, and making sure that, you know, the child feels safe and things are predictable, that there's a scaffolded communication in school, so that we're looking at using visuals to support kids' understanding of aggression and swearing, or not aggression and swearing, but so that there's the communication is there.
Yeah.
And there's programs in school to do with to support emotional regulation, like zones of regulation, which we're seeing coming into school more and more to support children recognizing in themselves when those emotions are creeping up and they need a bit of support. But I will come back to answer those questions.
I just think it's really interesting that somebody's commented in the chat that she or he is a teacher of 24 years as a teacher, had no training on FASD, and says, as it was probably not known as it is today, and SEN training was very minimal over a 4-year degree course. So I guess that's, you know, if they've been a teacher for 24 years, I guess that's like, you know, a long time ago when their training went. But considering the increase in SEN, or the recognition of SEN, I think. I mean, I'm pretty sure that it was always there. It's just that we didn't recognise or diagnose or have a label or anything. But now we do. So you've got to consider the amazing teachers that are in the education system who quite clearly were not educated themselves in terms of being able to manage and support and scaffold these children that are coming through now with diagnosis that we recognise and that we talk about. And we're suddenly expecting people who are professionals to know what to do when they weren't trained.
And we have to remember that society has changed an awful lot in the mix of children that we see in a mainstream school, for example, is much broader than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. There's much less in Scotland, much less in the way of additional support bases, of special school places, because the drive is to have a much more inclusive society. And that's fantastic, because it means we're seeing in school a much greater range of people, and we are beginning to think much more about how we communicate, we empower, we celebrate lots of different people in the way that their brain works. But change is a really slow process.
Process.
Yeah, so some people are much further on in that journey of inclusive practice than others. But I think a lot of the strategies that we use in additional support needs they're transferable.
So before we move on, Paula, I'm just going to read this one comment in the chat, which I think is so lovely from the teacher's perspective, but so probably something that teachers face. So a teacher said, same here. I've taught for 20 years and have only started learning about FASD this past year due to a diagnosed child joining my class. Unfortunately, if I had not sought training myself and taken it upon myself in my own time, my knowledge would be minimal. And I sort of feel as a lived experience parent, I'm like cheering that teacher, because that is amazing. But I just wonder how many teachers are in that position, that there's no training, there's no support, there's nobody telling them what FASD is, and yet they're suddenly landed with a child with a diagnosis which is very complex, and there's nowhere to go.
Well, there is, Jo, because there's the FASD hub.
Exactly. And you, Paula, you can come to the hub and you can come to you. but that's it, isn't it? You know, that's the sad thing. There is the FASD hub, and there's Adoption UK, and there's you, but ultimately the resources for supporting is few and far between nowadays.
But as part of that is because it's the process, and things are coming, but they are not there yet. We're seeing the need before we've prepared for it, really, I suppose. So hopefully things will change more quickly. Jo, shall I move on?
Let's move on, because the questions are thick and fast, Paula, and otherwise we won't get finished.
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna cut this section right down, if that's okay, and just say that one of the positives that we've got in Scotland is the Getting It Right for Every Child framework, because the Scottish Government's aim is to provide all children and young people with the right support at the right time, so that every child and young person in Scotland reaches their full potential. And that guidance puts young people and the families really at the heart of the policy, and it's a strengths-based approach. On paper, it is exactly the kind of guidance that promotes the support that we want for our children. It's also a national practice model, meaning that the local governments across Scotland all have that same framework, the same language to support and protect children, but it's locally embedded. And that means that it's up to local governments to, I suppose, resource it and to put it into practice. And we know that putting something like that into practice is not without lots and lots of issues. But I think what's important for us to hang on to is the fact that children and young people and their rights are at the heart of this, and therefore we can use that to advocate for our children. And something I didn't realise actually until fairly recently is that the guidance in this states that any practitioner or professional providing support to the child can be the lead professional. And the lead professional is the person that coordinates the child's plan. And in my experience, in most cases, the lead professional is probably a member of senior management team. But this guidance made me think that for those families who are really struggling with relationships with schools, this is maybe your key to having somebody else from your team to be leading child planning process. So if you've got CAM's involvement, or you've got an educational psychologist who really gets your child and gets the needs, but you think that the school staff that you're dealing with don't quite get that need yet, because, as we've just discussed, FESD knowledge hasn't quite caught up yet, then maybe you want to be making sure that the lead professional is the person with the most knowledge of FESD. And again, GIRFIC is a framework, so it's not kind of the written law, if you like, but it is backed by the law, it's backed by children's rights, and it's backed by the Additional Support for Learning Act 2004. So you as a parent, when you're advocating for your child, and if you think that the local authority hasn't met its obligations to provide support, then those are the things that you're using to challenge, I suppose. And then just really very quickly, the GIRFIC is about putting support in as early as possible. So in theory, as soon as you see a need, the teacher is expected to meet that need in their classroom, and they've got tools to be able to do that. So they can go to the Circle document, which is all about inclusive practice. They can identify the difficulty, they can match it up with a strategy, they can try and put that in place. And that's kind of level one of early intervention or support. If that's not enough, then somebody else in school, like the deputy head, or not deputy head, the support for learning teacher, might step in, and pupil support might kick in to provide extra support. And then if there's still more support that's needed, then you might be looking at services round about in terms of speech and language, educational psychology. And if you're still looking for extra support, then you end up, sorry, I've just realised I didn't mention that all of GIRFIC rests, or support, if you like, rests on something called staged intervention approach, which is this kind of different levels of meeting support. So level one is in the classroom, level two is somewhere within the school, level three, you're maybe looking at outside the school, and maybe level four, for more complex needs, you're looking at bases and you're looking at special schools. And you kind of have to understand those different levels or stages in order for you to be able to use that system to your advantage. So there has to be this system and procedure for local authorities for it to be fair and transparent. Where did I get to? And my suggestion for parents would be that each time support is introduced, it has to be evaluated. And as a parent, you would be keeping notes of the additional support need that you've got. You would be keeping notes of the successes of the supports, but you'd also be keeping a note of where the need continued to be not met. And then you would use that information and that evidence at your at the meetings that you have with school to say, look, we've still got needs. What more can we do to meet the needs of my child? And that kind of takes time to work through each of those different stages. which is quite time consuming. But once you've got your head around that system of, in order to move through the stages, you have to have evidence that the school has put support in, evidence that there are still needs that are not being met, and then you can use that system to your advantage. And I know that it's really very difficult for families whose child has complex needs that might not be met within a mainstream class. And if school support is not sufficient, what do? You have to work through that system. But I think it's really important that you also keep a positive attitude, because the policy and the law are promoting your children's rights. So if the support isn't there and you can prove it, then you've got the system behind you. Yeah, if you reach the point where the next stage of intervention is being denied to you, then you would contact, in Scotland, you would contact Enquire, and they would talk you through the additional support for needs system and what you could do. And I think as long as you've got evidence, they'll be able to guide you. And I'm not going to say any more about planning. There's loads of overlap of that kind of system. But like Joe said earlier, if you're in Scotland and you needed a bit of extra support with education, then we could meet and have a one-to-one meeting. And I am going to come back to reframing in a little while. And before we stop for another question, Joe, I'm going to attempt to show a video that just talks about communication and stigma from the point of view of a young person in school. And I really like it because it really makes me think about those different perspectives that we had at the beginning, because we've obviously got this system of getting it right for every child. I've got my own views as a parent, and I've got my own views as a teacher. But it's really important for us to stop and take on board the point of view of our own children too, because they don't always agree with what we think as parents. Okay, now let me try and make sure I press the right buttons this time. Okay, it's only 1 minute, 20 seconds.
My mum told my guidance teacher that I was adopted because she wanted to make sure I got support. So an email was sent to all the teachers, but I'd rather tell people when I'm ready, when I feel I can trust them. My school has groups for LGBTQ and racism, but they don't have groups for care experience. I didn't know any children in school who were care experienced until I met this boy, a few years younger than me, who told me he was adopted. I didn't know what to say to him. Then I went on a 3-day trip and found out by accident that everyone else was care experienced too. I felt cheated. Why didn't they tell us straight up? It's confusing when teachers tell me different things. I'm not sure who to believe. I'm told a lot I should be grateful. Grateful for what? A lot of teachers believe stereotypes about adoption. I've been told I'll end up homeless. I've been shown depressing statistics about people with care experience. It's not right. I have to prove people wrong. It shouldn't be like that.
It's just very short, and I'm going to stop there. Joe, I don't know if that made anybody think or...
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, there's been lots of comments back and forth, but I think one of the ones that I think is probably the most appropriate to ask at this stage is one that we hear about not only tonight, but also in our one-to-one family support and in our training and in our breakout groups, is how can parents help get the message to teachers that their child is not fine and is masking, and often a very different child at school than at home. Because I think, I mean, I personally experienced this and I know I work with many families who say this, that it's because FASD has that very spiky profile and everybody's different, but I think a lot of people face that challenge of, you know, they're 18 here, they're 20 with expressive language, they're 6 with communication. So how do you communicate that as a parent to a teacher who doesn't have knowledge or experience without trying to be the person who knows, because you're dealing with a professional as a parent? So what is the appropriate way to handle that?
I think one of the things that I would suggest is that you look at your child's team, and you look at who else you're bringing in to have those conversations with you. So if you can get educational psychologist involvement, if you can get the involvement of an advocacy service, if you could get the involvement even of a family friend that goes with you to have those conversations with you, so that it's not just you that's presenting that information, that it's coming from more than one source. But there are also, you know, in Scotland, the National Autism Team have got, you know, fantastic resources about masking that you could pick up and that you could use. There's lots of little masking videos. One of the parents in my school, at one point we did videos for something, and she did a fantastic little video for me that was only about 40 seconds long, and it was talking about how tiring it was when you start a new job, and when you go into a new job and you put on your best front, and you think about your language, you think about what you're wearing, and you kind of don't slip up all the time that you're there. And she talked about how absolutely exhausting it was, because she didn't feel like herself in that environment. And for her child in school, that's what it's like for her child all of the time.
Every day.
Every day. So that opens up conversations about how do we put in recovery times for the child.
Yeah.
But I would say that probably the best thing to do is pull other people into the conversation with you. I think.
Yeah, I think that's always a good thing, to have somebody else who's like fighting your corner.
Yeah.
I think as a parent, obviously you're so invested in your own child. It's often really good to have somebody sitting alongside you. I know for me, even though I know so much about FASD, it's, you know, when I'm in a school meeting, it's about my child and it's not always about what I know. So having somebody sit alongside me, chirping in, saying, yeah, well, the reason that happens is adaptive function or executive function, or, you know, and just bringing back all the time to the brain, which, you know, any special educational needs teacher, regardless of their knowledge of FASD, know about brain differences. So they can say they haven't have an FASD child, but they definitely know those things that our kids struggle with, you know, in different ways, I'm sure. So I definitely think for me, having somebody sit alongside as not only just as like a support, but also to remind me, because I think as a parent, you can be so emotionally invested in your child that you sometimes you forget. You sometimes can be so emotional that the facts don't come through, because you just go to emotion, and you're a bit like your child. You're like stuck in that fight flight. Oh, I need you to listen. No. You know, so I think having somebody to regulate you as a parent and make sure you put across the absolute facts to a professional is great.
So I'm looking at the time. Do you want me to bash on, because the next section is probably the bit that's got some of the answers?
Yes, I definitely do. Let's bash on.
Right, bash on, and then hopefully there'll be time for a question at the end as well. Let's see. Might move on for me. Yeah, so the next wee bit, I was thinking, you know, life is really full on for us, and we often run out of time and energy because there's so much going on for us. And when we've got these really complex needs in front of us and school is maybe generating more problems for you, how do you know what's the first thing to prioritise? So I thought it might be worthwhile breaking things down into these kind of 3 circles. But obviously there's a bit of caution there too, because people's circumstances differ. So if this is a section on the things that are within our control as a parent, and the thing that and it might seem strange to start with parenting at the top, but the learning that a child does when they're with you is the foundation for the learning that they do in school. And you've got control over how you parent. You've got control over your language, the way that you interact with your child, the way that you respond to the child that you've got in front of you, and the way that you interpret their behaviour when something goes off. And children, because children interpret the world differently to us, when they're affected by childhood trauma and their relationships with adults can be insecure, we need to consciously choose our parenting approach to suit the child that we've got in front of us. So that might mean for us taking on new learning, it might mean taking on a therapeutic approach, or working with the hub to develop specific strategies that suit the strengths of the learners that we've got. But when we adapt our parenting approach, it means that our child encounters less stress and conflict with us, and we build up a bit of resilience, we build up a bit of helping to stretch their tolerance levels, which means that for our child, when they go off to school, they've got that little bit more room in their cup to take on some of the stresses that the school environment throws out. And the reason I put the second one in there really was to remind us that when we talk about FASD, when you build your knowledge of FASD, it's really important to me that you share that knowledge with your child, and that when you talk about FASD, you focus on the strengths that come with that profile, that you give your language, you give your child the language to talk about their strengths and talk about the challenges and identify the things that work for them, that support them, because knowledge is power. And as they gain confidence with you and they take that confidence into school, they can better explain to other people what's going on for them. And if a child can get across in some way, whether it's visually or whether it's with words, what they need, then staff, generally speaking, will go out of their way to make that happen. And how we talk about FASD is entirely within our own control. So we can be factual, we can be clear, we can have conversations with our child, so that we frame it in the right way for our child. And if we're talking about the challenges that come with FASD, and for example, within a school context, if somebody gets hurt because your child is dysregulated, then I wouldn't approach that punitively. I might take the child aside, I might empathise with the child, I might remind them about FASD and how it might affect emotional impulses, and then we might talk about what we might do next time we feel that. I might use zones of regulation, or we might have identified a strategy or a tool that we could use, even if it's something like Remember Stop, 5-star breathing, whatever it is, because it's not okay to hit people. But we do that sort of validating, recognising difficulties, not condoning the action, and focusing on a positive. And I don't believe in punishments at all. Generally speaking, I think when children do something wrong, they feel bad enough on their own about it, and they just need more support to manage. And I think that framing, and I'm going to come back to framing again, is really important. If we talk about exclusions at school, that's another topic entirely. But I think if your child is excluded, I think how you talk about that at home is really important, and you can put a different lens on it to minimise any damage. So you can frame it as a school is giving you the time at home to feel safe. School can see that they didn't have the right support in place for you. The school needs time to reflect and improve on their support so that when you go back, they can better keep you safe. You can ask them, you know, what do you think they need to do? So you've totally reframed it for them in a different way. And another thing you've got control over is the fact that your views are an important part of that getting it right for every child's system. So if you have a planning meeting with school, those meetings are minuted and you can submit your views as part of that process. I've also seen families kind of read a prepared statement during those meetings so that the views are officially minuted. So when it comes to something like masking that you talked about before, Jo, that's the kind of thing that you could bring up in a planning meeting so that it has to be minuted and written down, so that if later on you get to the stage of saying to school, you're not meeting my child's needs, you can go back and say, well, here's my evidence, look, we talked about it in this planning meeting. And again, one of the reasons why I think the parenting part is so important is because the school environment contains so many stressors for kids. If you forget maths and literacy, the physical and social demands of school are really difficult to manage on their own. And we as parents can support that because we can reduce the demands of a school uniform. It's a reasonable adjustment to adapt the uniform. So my child, I think I bought 4 sweaters for her high school and she wore it once and has never worn the uniform since then because it's a real stressor for her. We can ease the transition in and out of school. We can go in slightly later, slightly earlier to avoid crowds. That's another reasonable adjustment. We can take a distraction with us on the transition. We can take a dog, a scooter, we can take the walking bus, we can use a transition object, anything to kind of distract from the difficulties of a transition. We can provide sensory snacks, which give a preferred sensory feedback that again just makes our child maybe a bit more comfortable in school. We can do things like, I think I dressed my child right up into primary 7 to take away the extra demand for her of having to plan what to put on and what to put on next, so that by the time she got to school, she just had that little more tolerance for demands that came at her from the school context. So there's lots of things we can do there. We're increasing the tolerance for school by giving coping mechanisms and things like play as well, because our children are likely to need more play experiences or more sensory experiences. We can facilitate that from an at-home point of view. We can give downtime before and after school so that there's no demands from us, because I think a lot of the frustration that we get from children, a lot of the overwhelm we get, is because there's just too many demands coming at them. I would never have asked my child to do homework straight after. In fact, I never asked my child to do anything straight after school, because it would have led to a big meltdown, because her social battery was just very low. We've got control over the school routines, and that can be a really good anchor for our children, because predictability leads to feelings of safety. We can share the plan. We can make sure our children know what's happening before and after, we know what's happening for the whole day. That lets them prepare. That's why visual timetables are so useful in school. And when I say share the plan, that's what I mean, share it visually, have a calendar on the fridge so that it reduces your child's anxiety about what's coming. You can teach flexibility. When the plan changes, you can rearrange the events, you can use a surprise card, you can talk about having a plan B, and that's really useful to start thinking about with your child, because as much as we know that predictability is what's needed, it is very difficult to achieve in school because of so many different factors. So if we can start to sow the seeds of flexibility and the fact that there can be another plan, then that's going to again be another coping mechanism for kids in school. Again, we also know that children with neurodivergent thinking or with traumatic early life experiences process communication in very literal or unexpected ways. So when you give an instruction, you might need to chunk instructions or give written checklists to help them achieve, and those are things that you should see happening in school with your child to provide extra support. And something else that's worth considering are the things that you can influence. So the parenting things you've got complete control over. You don't have complete control over the things that happen in school, but you do have the power to influence things. So when we need to think, and this is for one of the questions you asked earlier, Joe, we need to think about how we influence people's attitudes so that we're all moving in the same direction to support the child. And that's where this idea of framing comes in. We've got to choose really carefully how we present information so that it changes people's attitudes and leads to different actions. We don't want them to continue with the stigma or the misinformation, but we can't afford to go in and challenge it up front in case we don't get the reaction that we want. We need to think about how we influence people and avoid presenting it in a way that's going to harm our cause. So an example of that would be my child came back with a reading book that was all about adoption. It had the phrase in it, your parents didn't want you, that's why you gave you up for adoption. And it was in a reading book, and I was doing shared reading with my child, and I was supposed to read that line. And I just saw absolute red, and I fired off a very emotional email to the head teacher, and I ranted about it for several days. And of course, what happened was that the head teacher had a very defensive reaction, and it shut down a much more productive conversation for me. And what I wish I'd done was tell a much better story. And it would have been a story about how every child needs to be calm and regulated for learning. And that when children are learning to read, they're focused on decoding, making sense of the words on the page. The word adoption isn't necessarily an expected word in a reading lesson. It triggered a panicked response in my daughter because of her early life experiences. So then she was disadvantaged in the reading lesson because she was making connections to her personal experience, and she was no longer focused on decoding. But by choosing a different book, then every child can focus on the same skills and nobody is disadvantaged. And that is what I wish I'd been able to do at that time. So the recommendations that I'm going to share with you now come from the Each and Every Child organisation. They're recommendations that are based on the idea that mental shortcuts guide our thinking, and we make associations when we see and hear stories, and these kind of form the assumptions that we've got about the world. So the general public, which is your school staff, will have ideas about FASD, and they'll have ideas about adoption or about care experience based on the things that they've seen and heard over their life, but they're not necessarily accurate. And we might need to use our influence to change those attitudes so that they're much more accurate and in line with what we want them to be. So, number one, when you've got conversations with school staff, always talk about the things that every child needs, because they need the same things. They need stability, they need support, they need good relationships. And you're not asking for special treatment for your child. The teacher's not having to do something extra for your child. You're asking for the same things that everybody needs in order to be able to learn. And by using that inclusive language, that's really helpful, because teachers in schools are responsible for all children. So it helps to keep them focused on what's right for everybody. And then you can talk about how the school can support healthy development. Certainly in Scotland, we've got that getting it right for every child policy. There's a really strong focus on well-being and mental health. So what we want to avoid doing, if we can, as parents, are using words like failing, broken, damage, vulnerable. Basically because those can reinforce those unhelpful associations that people might already have. What we want to do is focus on the strengths, and how if we use those strengths, then we can support difficulties, and it's much more positive. We can also use metaphors to help people get it. So scaffolding is the metaphor we want to use when we're talking about supporting children, because that's what a scaffolding does. It supports a building before it's ready to stand on its own. So a supportive structure is needed to help your child get through difficult times. We need a framework that's going to offer stability. We need something that's constructive, that's reinforcing. There's a good base, something that's going to prop our children up. We need to have some strength. We need a structure. All of these words help to get across this idea of our child needs more help, without necessarily coming out and saying that. And then the other thing that we need to think about is, and what we might, when we have children with really complex needs that are not being met, we might find ourselves in a position where we're coming up against discrimination, or we're coming up against stigma. And we need to think about the fact that if we just say that, if we just say, look, this is discrimination, that actually might cause us harm, and reinforce the stigma, because if we accuse somebody of discrimination, it might lead to them feeling rejected and defensive. They stop listening to us, and start focus on how they can defend themselves. And we need them to be open to listening and taking on that new perspective. So we need to explain where the stigma comes from. We need to talk about the media pictures, the stories of children in care who are troubled, the featuring photos of children with FASD, with the facial features. We need to talk about how all of those things build up that unhelpful knowledge base, and can lead to stigma or discrimination, and how that affects people in all walks of life. But we can change that, and that's the message. Then you will go on to explain how you do that. And again, one of the really helpful things is when you're in that child planning meeting, is focusing on the fact that everybody can make a change. And that's where, I hear so many people say that the education system is broken. And if we do that, step back and go, well, there's nothing I can do because it's broken. What we need to do instead is look at what we can do collectively to improve things. So if we focus on solutions, if we pull together, we can make these positive changes. So in that planning meeting, when you're leaving, everybody should have a specific job that's going to contribute to the plan. Nobody should be leaving the planning meeting having just sat there and listened. There should be a job for everybody. And I think if you've done a connected parenting course or an NVR course, the premise of that is the same. We can't control other people's reactions. We can only control our own actions. But if we're deliberate and we avoid escalation, then we can cause a change in that other person's behaviour and attitude. So that's really thinking really carefully about the words that we use, so that we're building a kind of story around our child, around the thing that we want to say. And if we do that, then we're influencing the support plan. I hope that makes sense. And then the last wee bit, the things that are out of our control. I think we have to think about how much energy we want to expend on these things, because there's nothing we can do about our child's past trauma. There's nothing we can do about our child's neurodevelopmental condition, whether we've named it or given it a diagnosis or not. Our child's brain works the way that it does. They can't change who they are, but we can change the things that we do and we say and our environment. And I suppose that's what we want to see within school staff doing as well. We want to see them taking on board those messages. We can control what happens in our house, and we can influence what happens in school. We can't control the things that our child does, but hopefully our behaviour and responses will influence them. We can influence policy and procedure through campaigning work, but it's a slow process to make changes to policy. And our child might not see the benefit of the campaigning that we do to have a big change of that nature. Sorry, that sounds so pessimistic, but because change takes time on a really big level, any campaigning work is going to be very positive. But if you only have a finite amount of energy, and you are really wanting to focus on making changes for your child, are you making changes with the things that you can control? That's basically what I was thinking there. And then the last one, we can't change teachers' personalities. We don't control which teacher our child has, but we can influence their attitude if we're very clever in our communication. And I would suggest you go back and have a look at the Each and Every Child recommendations. So I haven't spoken about supports and strategies that teachers might use in school to support children with FASD, but what I hope I've done is get you to think very differently about what you can do as a parent that might help you to work with school so that your child thrives in the school environment. And I'll just flag up, these are 2 checklists for educators that are on the Adoption UK website and the Kinship website that basically just have a list of strategies. So the things I haven't shared with you that school could do are contained in these 2 documents for teachers. They've got links to other organisations where they can get a wee bit more information or a wee bit more support about something. So there's links in there to the FASD Hub, but there's also lists of things like, if the child doesn't feel safe in school, these are some things that you could try. If your child doesn't manage transitions, these are some things that you could try with the child. And it's literally just a tick list. So that might be quite useful for some people. And please remember that it's a learning journey and it's different for everybody, and you will most definitely be much further on your journey than loads of the professionals and teachers that you meet. But hopefully they will catch up with you. So have I got time for some more questions, Jo?
Well, we're over time anyway, but we've had like lots of chat. A lot of it is about how to speak to teachers, and I think you've covered that really well. I think
it's definitely about the framing, definitely. Yeah. Really thinking about that very carefully.
I think it's been fabulous, Paula. I think we could have had you for another 2 hours easily.
I could clearly talk that long.
I think it's been absolutely amazing. There's been lots of activity. Barbara's been in the background posting stuff. I mean, as you said at the beginning, people can contact us anyway and follow up if they've got further questions. I think it's been so informative, and I think for parents it's really good to feel heard from somebody who works in education, because for very many people with lived experience, they often feel like they're just battling something. So I think it's really nice to hear from somebody who actually works in it that, you know, there is a way to navigate that system. I think the response has been brilliant. I don't think we can keep you any longer, but thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm sure we're going to have loads and loads of people asking questions, but I think we should say good night.
I'm very happy to answer questions in a written form somehow.
Thank you, Paula.
You are welcome.
So good night, people. Thank you for joining us. Join us at our next Wednesday webinar.